Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another Sunday Miscellany. If you're new to the channel or new to this feature, my Sunday Miscellany videos are where I give a reading update in the same way as Friday Reads video, and where I also talk about some of the highlights from the music that I've listened to for the week and some of the movies that I've watched. And I always start these videos with the music, and I always leave a link to a Spotify playlist in the description of some of the highlights of the music that I listen to. So if you're interested, you can find the music there. But just to chat briefly about what is in there, I didn't do a lot of listening this week, listening to new stuff. I'm always listening to music, but I didn't listen to a lot of new stuff this week. So it's a short playlist by my standards, but there's some interesting stuff in it. The first one is an opera, Der Freischütz by Karl Maria von Weber. This is a early 19th century German opera, opera that is kind of credited with sparking German opera as an institution, as a big cultural force. Before Der Freischütz, German opera, or before Weber, I suppose, maybe not Der Freischütz individually, but before this composer, Karl Maria von Weber, German opera was not a big thing. You know, Mozart had written a couple of operas in German, but that did not have the same effect that Weber's work did. It did not spark a tradition of German opera. They just sort of stood as individual works, and then most of Mozart's other operas were all in Italian, like most operas were before Weber. Most opera in the 16th century and before was in Italian. That was thought of as the operatic language, and it was Weber who changed that, or helped to change that. And I really, really liked this opera. It has some lovely singing. The overture is extremely famous. It's probably the most famous piece that Weber ever wrote. He's not a super well-known composer these days, so there's some great music in this opera, even though it's not maybe one of the most popular ones, maybe not one of the ones that you've heard of if you're not like a super opera fan like I am. But there are some really lovely musical moments. And it just solidified for me the fact that German opera really is my passion in terms of the operatic canon. There's something about the way German composers compose opera and the way German sounds in opera that appeals to me. I'm not quite sure what it is yet, but I love it. And I love other aspects of opera too. There are Italian operas that I like, there are operas in English that I like, obviously there are Russian and Czech operas that I like, but I think German is my passion. And that theme is continued in my second selection this week, which is another opera, and this is a very different kind of animal. This is Moses and Aaron by Arnold Schoenberg. And I didn't even know that Arnold Schoenberg ever wrote any operas until like last year. I just didn't think of him as an opera composer, but he did compose a couple. And this is a retelling of the story of the Golden Lamb from the Book of Exodus in Schoenberg's characteristic, atonal style. I'm not sure that this is a 12-tone piece, but it is atonal. And it's eerie, it's really powerful. There are a lot of really powerful, big moments, but there are also some moments of real lyrical beauty, and it was hard for me to capture those in the playlist because they're often sort of very transient, very sort of nestled within a longer piece that isn't so lyrical and beautiful. So I only have the opening of the opera in the playlist, but it is a really interesting opera, it sounds like. I think it would be more powerful to see live than it is to listen to like this, but it was a really interesting piece, so I'm leaving that one bit of it in the playlist. And then the last thing I listened to was something very, very different. I listened to A Stranger in the Alps by Phoebe Bridgers, which was just recommended to me on Spotify, and so I clicked on it, and it's sort of a lyrical indie rock or indie pop album, and I thought it was wonderful. It seems to explore grief a lot, grief and loss, and so it has a very melancholy tone, but it's very, very soothing, very, very lovely, and so I'm leaving a couple of songs from that. So now moving on into the books, which is the part that most people care about. So I finished 2 books, and I'm going to finish a 3rd book later today. So I'll start with the 2 books that I finished, and the first one of those is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This is a science fiction novel that takes place in the near future, and in this near future, climate change and also rampant, uncontrolled capitalism have kind of destroyed the social fabric. Basically, people have to live in violent squalor, or they're rich as hell and live in mansions. And the book is about this young woman named Lauren Olamina, who lives in this community not far from LA, which is, full of violence and drug addiction, and where people struggle to survive and find food. And the main character decides at one point in the novel to set out from her hometown and try to escape the United States for Canada, because she thinks it will be more safe. And she kind of has a ragtag group of people along with her, and she picks up more people along the way. And she also invents her own religion called Earthseed, which is based on the idea that everything is change, that God is change. And so the religion is sort of centered around almost this worship of change in a way. And she starts to try to convert people to this religion. And so there's not much in the way of fireworks in this story. There's not a huge, complicated plot. There are no battles. There's no real intrigue. It's not a plot-driven story, really. Even though a lot happens in it, it's not a plot-driven story by any means. But basically, it's a story of Lauren and this group of people trying to find a way to have community and safety in this world that is extremely violent and full of forces that are trying to destroy community. They all want community, and they all want meaning and safety in this world. And Lauren clearly hopes that Earthseed will be the path to that. But anyway, I will say that when I first finished the book, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. There were just some aspects that I felt a little bit underutilized. But the more I've thought about it, the more it's grown on me, the more I've liked it. I think Lauren is such a compelling heroine. She is flawed, she gets angry, she, steals from people to survive. She also has this thing called hyper-empathy, which means that she feels all of the physical pain that other people near her are feeling. And she is just such an interesting heroine, I think. Octavia Butler herself actually said that she wanted Lauren to be the kind of person who, after she had died and some of her more rough edges had disappeared from people's minds, people could think of as a god. And I think I can totally see that. Again, she's flawed, but she has such a force of personality and is so intelligent that I find her to be a really interesting character. So I really liked her. What I think I appreciate the most about Parable of the Sower is the way that its dystopian world is realized. This dystopian world where environmental degradation and climate change have just ravaged the social fabric feels so very plausible. I really do think that something like this world is actually where we're headed. Not to get too gloomy on all of you, but I think it is. I think Octavia Butler had her finger so well on the pulse of where, particularly the United States, is headed. Especially again with the climate change, but also with the rampant market capitalism, and also with the rise of right-wing nationalism. There's a sort of strong man as president of the United States in this dystopian future, which is kind of close to home. And I found that to be so great, and I found it to be such a powerful portrayal of economic inequality and life under poverty and in urban squalor, sort of. So I really loved that aspect. And two things that were my initial reservations that I think have kind of moved away, that I think I've kind of gotten over. One is that I feel like Lauren's hyper-empathy is somewhat underutilized. It doesn't feel like there's that much of a point to it. It feels like it's just kind of there as something for her to talk about, and it doesn't really ever play a big part in the story at all. And so I was puzzled as to what the point of it was. The other aspect that I had a reservation about was the Earthseed religion. Again, it seemed a little bit underutilized. Like, it just sort of was articulated and talked about, but it never took on another level of meaning within the story, or resonance within the story somehow, for me. But again, I think both of these have kind of disappeared. I think maybe I was expecting those two things to be more central than they were. They were a bit, I think, supposed to be slightly more peripheral to just the struggle for, you know, community and meaning and safety in this very violent, difficult world. And so I've kind of set those aside. I really, really like this book, and I'm really excited to read the sequel, The Parable of the Talents. So if you've read Parable of the Sower, give me your thoughts, and yeah, I'm really excited to read Parable of the Talents, and certainly more Octavia Butler. You know, I know Kindred is her most famous novel. I will definitely be reading that. The second book that I finished was Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Katherine Boo. And this is kind of a piece of nonfiction that follows several real people living in a slum called Annawadi that is very close to the city of Mumbai in India. And obviously Mumbai is becoming well known as this very global city. It's one of the most important cities in the world, and it's known kind of as a very wealthy city. But then there's this, you know, underbelly to it, where there's all these people living in horrible poverty, you know, living in shacks, or who are homeless, and who basically, a lot of them collect garbage and sell it for recycling to make a living. And anyway, so this book follows several people who live in Annawadi, in one of these slums, and it explores all of these really important themes. You know, obviously life under poverty, political corruption in the government, incompetent criminal justice system, pollution, sexism, racism, religious discrimination, and so on. There are Muslim people in the story, and there are Hindu people in the story. Obviously, that is a big dynamic in India, the relationship between Hindus and Muslims. And so there's so many important issues explored. And it was actually really interesting reading this alongside Parable of the Sower, because a lot of those themes are also in Parable of the Sower. So they became a really interesting pair. But what I really liked about the Behind the Beautiful Forevers is that there's always nuance. You know, nothing is ever black and white. Even characters who are corrupt and who do bad things occasionally are not made out to be villains. And characters who try to be good also are flawed, also, you know, lash out at their family, or aren't always there for their family, or steal or something. There's always nuance. There's never a black and white moralizing about what people do, and I think that is most characterized by Asha, this one woman who basically becomes wealthy through political corruption, through becoming a slumlord, as it's called, and she gains wealth through an avenue that we would say is corrupt and fraudulent, and yet she is not. Katherine Boo does not show her out to be a horrible person. You know, she just wants what's best for her daughter. Her daughter, who is named Manju, who hopes to be the first college graduate from Annawadi, and who is running the school that Asha is ostensibly running. So this school that Asha is supposed to be running is being taught by her teenage daughter, and it's being taught basically by rote, and you know, Manju in her college studies, that is also taught by rote. So the schools are not very good, and that's a big theme that comes in as well, is the power of education, but also the real, you know, kinks in the armor of the education system in India. So there's just a lot to chew on in the book. You know, if I were to continue talking about it, I could go on at length in this video. And what I think is so good is that these issues are all woven in to the story so well. You know, primarily what Katherine Boo is doing is telling the stories of these people, right? And she tells them so well in really great prose, with a lot of sympathy, and these themes are just woven right in. You know, you're not slapped over the head with them, but you do feel them as you go. And it was so good in that sense. One reservation I have, and I mentioned it last week, is the style it's written in. So it is written in kind of a novelistic fashion, where there are kind of dialogue pieces put in people's mouths. Katherine Boo will write, you know, so-and-so thought this, or so-and-so felt that, as though she had, like, insight into their head and could walk around in their skin, sort of, like a novelist would try to. And that sort of thing can be really powerful, and I think it is powerful in this book, but it also rubs me the wrong way. Because I feel like, for one thing, if you're going to write a book of nonfiction, just write a nonfiction book, okay? If you want to write a novel, write a novel. But if you want to write a piece of nonfiction, write a piece of nonfiction. And let it succeed as a piece of nonfiction, rather than trying to have it pretend to be a novel to make people more interested in it. And secondly, it strikes me as disingenuous, because there's often no way that the author could be privy to those lines of dialogue and those thoughts of those characters. And so I really have reservations about that kind of style, and I don't want to say that I find it suspect, but I think there's something to be said for the fact that we can't really know how Katherine Boo got those insights. How did she come across these lines of dialogue? How did she get so much insight into how each character was thinking and feeling? Did she really do that much research, or is there some level of invention on her part? I don't know. I don't want to accuse Katherine Boo of anything, but that's why I have a trouble with this style, because it always leaves open that level of ambiguity about whether or not the author is being truthful. So I have reservations about the style, but it is so well written, and it explores so many important issues, and portrays the people in it with so much, sympathy and warmth, and almost a Dickensian quality. I was reading Jason from Chapter and Verse's review of the book, and he referred to this book as Dickensian, and it really is kind of Dickensian, in a good way, not a bad way. And it is so well written that I'm willing to forgive its stylistic sins. So I do recommend this book if it sounds up your alley. And so, now I move into the books that I am working on or starting today. I plan to finish Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. This is a reread for me. I read this book for the first time a few years ago when I was in college, and I remember really, really liking it when I read it then. And I am loving it even more now. So I'm really excited to review it, and I will do that in depth next week. So watch out for my next Sunday Miscellany for that. And then the novel that I'm going to begin today is The Thousand Crimes of Ming by Tom Lin. This is a Western about an Asian American man named Ming who is trying to gain revenge for the kidnapping of his lover, basically. And so it's supposed to be a bit of a revisionist Western, because it's about an Asian American man, and Asian American people are not the kind of people we tend to see portrayed in Westerns. It has drawn comparisons to the work of Cormac McCarthy, which has me very excited because I love Cormac McCarthy. I'm buddy reading this with Patrice Jones, and that should be a lot of fun. But I will be starting that today and reading it over the course of the next week or so. So keep your eyes out for my review. And so that rounds out the books. Now I will move on into the movies. Now I watched 4 movies this week, all of them pretty interesting. The first one is Election, directed by Alexander Payne. The second was Mirror, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. The third was The Grandmaster, directed by Wong Kar Wai. And the fourth was A City of Sadness, directed by Hsiao-Hsien. And so the two that I want to talk about are Mirror and A City of Sadness. If you want to hear more about The Grandmaster or Election, you can ask me in the comments, but I can't talk about every film that I watch because it always just ends up being too much. So, anyway, Mirror, directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. This is from 1975. It is my second favorite film of all time. It is obviously my favorite Tarkovsky film, by some margin, I must say, which isn't to say that Andrei Rublev and Stalker and other films of his aren't all masterpieces, but Mirror for me is just like if every other film is on a 1 to 10 scale, then Mirror is on like the scale of 10,000 or something like that. It is just so sublime. I watched it this week and just I finished it, and I just felt like I had to take a moment to let the divinity of the film just fade away for a minute before I could really start functioning as a person again. It is just such a sublime film. It is visually beautiful. It is auditorily really interesting. I just recently acquired the Criterion Collection edition of Mirror, and I was listening to an interview with the composer for the film, who didn't actually compose much of the music. He was more of a sound designer, because most of the music is pieces by Bach and Purcell and Pergolesi and other composers. So most of what he did was just sound mixing and coming up with some sound effects. But it's a really auditorily very interesting film. For me, this film conveys, more than any other film, the weight of an entire human life. You know, just how momentous one human life, in which perhaps on the surface not much has happened. You know, it portrays that immensity so well, and it's just such a sublime piece of work, and it's a very difficult film. You know, I always tell people it's the hard sell to end all hard sells, because I did not get it on my first viewing. Most people do not get it on their first viewing. I have watched it 7 or 8 times now, so I have started to see its structure more. But that's not to say that I fully understand it. You know, it's made in a way that is poetic rather than linear or narrative based. It's actually, I think, directed in the way that memory is how we remember things. A lot of people will say that it's made in the way that a dream is made, but I actually think it's more in the structure of a memory, because basically what the film is about is this man on his deathbed remembering his past and his mother's past as he's dying. And when you remember your own past, you never remember it in a linear fashion. You never say, okay, I was born here, and then that happened to me, and then this happened to me, and then I turned 12, and then I turned 15. You always remember in fragments, and you always bounce around in time. You know, you would remember, oh yeah, my first memory is of going to the school bus, but then when I was 10 years old, this happened, and then when I was 16, that happened, and then when I was 12, that happened. That's how you remember your past, and that's how I think Mirror is made, is like in the form of someone remembering their past. And so that's why it's so difficult to follow and difficult to get your head around, because it does have a bit of an obtuse style. But I think if you just surrender yourself to its spell, then the fact that it's difficult to follow won't matter after a while. So I will leave it at that, because if I try to continue talking about Mirror, I tend to become incoherent, because it's a really difficult film to be coherent about. If anyone says to you that they have this film figured out, then you should absolutely not trust that person's opinion on anything film-related, because they do not. So anyway, but I want to recommend the film to you, because it is a remarkable piece of work. And then I thought I would talk about A City of Sadness, directed by Hsiao-Hsien. A very different animal from Mirror, to be sure. Hsiao-Hsien is a legend of the Taiwanese New Wave cinema movement, which I have grown intensely interested in of late. I have grown intensely interested in Taiwanese cinema, especially since discovering the work of Edward Yang, the great Taiwanese director Edward Yang. And so Hsiao-Hsien seemed like a natural director to explore, since he is another sort of legend of the Taiwanese New Wave. And this is considered by many to be a masterpiece of his, if not his absolute masterpiece. And it takes place during a very interesting period of history. It takes place around, between I think 1945 and 1949, in Taiwan, which was a very turbulent time, because you had the end of World War II, which also ended the Japanese occupation of Taiwan. Japan had occupied Taiwan for, I think, something like 50 years at that point. And so, at the end of World War II, you had the end of Japanese rule, the China retaking control of Taiwan, and then you had the Chinese Civil War between the communists and the nationalists, which obviously ended with the nationalists' defeat, and the nationalists sort of retreating under the command of Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan and sort of starting a government in exile, which is what the government in Taiwan still sort of is. And so it's this incredibly turbulent time, but also what was going on in Taiwan is that there were these basically purges of people who were thought to be political dissidents. You know, the nationalist government and the communist government were both very authoritarians. So this is not outside the realm of normal for the nationalist government. And so this film is about a family of 4 brothers and how they are affected by this terror, basically, by this purge. And it is a really powerful piece of work as well. I think it is difficult to follow at times. Your hand is not held in terms of what's going on, or why someone is doing something, or why someone was dragged away by the police. Your hand is also not held in terms of who is who. There's quite a large cast in this film, and they can be very difficult to keep track of, and I think I may need to rewatch the film in relatively short order to really get all the names down and have a sense of what even happened in the movie. But basically, it's about this family of 4 brothers and their friends and their wives and others around them who are affected by this terror. And while I had a hard time keeping track of the characters, it almost seemed like it wasn't that important to keep track of all the characters, by name at least, because it seemed like the film was a bit more like a mosaic of human lives and how these human lives were affected by this historical event, more than it was an exploration of individuals. Even though there are some remarkable individual characters. For example, my favorite performance in the film is by Tony Leung, who is very well known for his work with Wong Kar Wai, and who appeared in The Grandmaster, which I also watched this week. But he in this film plays one of the 4 brothers, and he's deaf. And so all of his communication is through writing. He writes stuff down for people to read, and they write stuff back to him, and that's how he communicates. And it's a remarkable performance. I love his character in this film. It is such a great character, and he has such a great relationship with Hinoe and Hinomi, these 2 sisters who he becomes very close friends with. But it is a film where I think I will have the measure of it better when I rewatch it. But you know, stylistically, I really liked it. It has a lot of static long takes, and I like static long takes, and I like long takes just in general. It has a kind of atmosphere that I love. There are certain films that I watch where I don't worry so much about getting everything that's going on just because I love the atmosphere so much, and this was definitely one of those kinds of films. And yeah, it was really, really good, I thought. And I will need to rewatch it before I can really feel like I have the measure of it, but it is really, really good. I'm gonna watch 2 more Hsiao-Hsien films this week, so you may be hearing about one of those in my next Miscellany video. So anyway, those are the films, and that is my Miscellany for this week. If you've read any of the books, listened to any of the music, watched any of the movies, let me know. We can talk about it in the comments, but I will leave it at that, and you all have a nice week. Bye.